My boyfriend of 4 months retaliated against me because I went out with my close friends until morning by calling me while he was having sex with his friends with benefits. Time has a tendency to curve around our feelings. Even though Brandon and I have only been dating for 4 months, the spectrum of emotions we have shared makes our time together feel both very short and shockingly lengthy. He studies architecture, while I study graphic design at VL University. We are both sophomores. Due to our mutual passion for design, we initially met in a freshman seminar. From the beginning, our talks were smooth and conversational, discussing our studies and aspirations for the future. We would frequently have coffee while surrounded by class models and sketches. In those early days, our relationship felt natural and easy. We spent many nights discussing our projects and ideas, which I always found enriching. Brandon's background was quite different from mine, particularly his strong Catholic faith and conservative views, which initially I found intriguing. He was upfront about his past and his values, including his limited experience with relationships, and his decision to mostly save himself for marriage. However, as we moved past the honeymoon phase of our relationship, I began to feel the weight of our differences more acutely. His traditional views, which I once admired, started to feel restrictive, especially around topics of intimacy and personal freedom. He had been very open about his conservative approach to relationships, but this openness sometimes made me uncomfortable and skeptical about how it would affect our relationship. Our first major challenge came when I committed to a major group project with my friends from the graphic design program. The project, named 50 Specimen Shapes, was an ambitious plan to create 3D models for various abstract shapes, combining artistic flair with scientific precision. As the deadline approached, my team decided to pull an all-nighter to finish our work. I was excited about the project and shared my plans with Brandon, hoping he would understand the commitment it required. Instead, his response was cooler than expected. He seemed uneasy, not just about the late night, but also about me being deeply involved in something outside of our relationship. His discomfort seemed to stem from his religious beliefs, which made him wary of the unpredictable nature of creative projects. His reaction left a coldness between us as I prepared for the night. There was a noticeable tension in his goodbye that evening, and even his hug felt forced. It made me wonder if our relationship, built on such different foundations, could really last. Despite this, I headed into the project night full of anticipation, but also concern, not realizing that the events of the evening would test our relationship even further. The day leading up to the planned all-nighter with my friends was a typical Thursday, marked by the usual rush of classes and the added buzz of creative energy that always seemed to spike as deadlines approached. I had spent most of the afternoon in the studio, putting the finishing touches on my part of the project, my mind racing with adjustments and improvements. The vibrant atmosphere was contagious, everyone throwing ideas back and forth, our workspace a testament to weeks of hard work and chaotic creativity. I checked my phone intermittently, noting the absence of any messages from Brandon. It was unusual, given that we often exchanged quick updates or words of encouragement throughout the day. Deciding to break the silence, I sent him a text, hoping to lighten his mood and possibly share some of my excitement. "Hey, busy day here but looking forward to tonight. Wish me luck," I typed, hoping the smiley face would bring a smile to his too. The reply came just as I was gathering my things to leave the studio for a quick dinner before the evening's marathon. "Good luck. We need to talk when you have a moment," the message read, void of any emojis that might hint at his mood. The brevity and tone of his text sent a small wave of anxiety through me. It was not what I had hoped to read, especially not today. Dinner was a rushed affair at a nearby cafe, where I sat alone with a sandwich and a cup of too strong coffee, mulling over Brandon's message. The cafe was cozy, a little nook that served as a frequent escape for me from the campus hustle. Today, however, the warmth of the cafe did little to ease the chill that had settled inside me. Returning to my apartment briefly, I found Brandon waiting for me, his figure slouched against the doorway of our small shared living room, an unmistakable tension in his posture. As I stepped inside, the look on his face was serious, more somber than I had seen in days. "Hey, you're home early," I said, trying to sound cheerful. Brandon just nodded, his eyes following me as I dropped my bag and took off my coat. "We need to talk about this project night of yours," he began, his voice steady but with an edge that immediately put me on guard. "I don't understand why you need to spend a whole night working on this with your friends. Doesn't seem like it's just about the project." His words stung, more so because they echoed a deeper distrust that seemed to have been growing between us. "It's just a project, Brandon. It's important for my course, and you know how these things go. We all push at the end to get everything perfect," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. Brandon crossed his arms, his brow furrowing slightly. "It's always about the project, isn't it? Or something else? I feel like you're slipping away, Doing all these things without me. And tonight, it just feels like you don't want me around. I sighed, feeling the weight of his words and the widening gap they represented. This isn't about not wanting you around, Brandon. This is about me needing to do this for my degree. For me. I thought you understood that. He looked away, the lines of his face hardening. I do. It's just hard sometimes. I miss how it used to be with us. There was a sadness in his voice that pulled at me, a reminder of simpler times when our biggest concerns revolved around which movie to watch or what dessert to share on a Saturday night. Now, standing in the dim light of our living room, those days felt like distant echoes overshadowed by the growing complexities of our relationship. I miss that too, I admitted softly, the distance between us feeling more profound in the silence that followed. Dinner ended with an uneasy truce, the issue temporarily set aside but the tension lingering like a stubborn fog. As I grabbed my things to head out, Brandon's voice stopped me at the door. Be safe, okay? He said, a trace of the old warmth in his voice that made my heart ache for what we were struggling to hold on to. I will. I promise, I responded, offering him a small hopeful smile before stepping out into the cool evening air. The night's possibilities stretched out before me like the sprawling campus pathways. The excitement for the project was still there, but now it was tinged with a poignant mixture of concern and longing for the relationship I was still learning to navigate. The night of the project was set to be intense, a blend of creativity and chaos as we worked against the clock. My friends and I had booked a study room in the university's main library, a space often reserved for late-night cram sessions and collaborative projects. As I arrived around 8 p.m., the familiar sense of excitement and nervous energy filled the air, palpable among the scattered laptops, strewn papers, and 3D materials that covered the tables. The first few hours flew by as we dove into our tasks. Anna, a meticulous planner, coordinated our efforts, ensuring everyone stayed on track with their assigned elements. John, ever the perfectionist, was immersed in adjusting the lighting on our 3D models, creating the perfect shadows that made our shapes seem almost lifelike. My role was to integrate the background graphics I had designed, ensuring they complemented rather than overwhelmed the models. At 10 p.m. I sent a quick message to Brandon. In full swing here. Hope your evening is relaxing. The immediate response I hoped for didn't come, and I pushed the slight worry away, redirecting my focus to the vibrant discussion on color schemes and textures swirling around me. Midnight approached, and we took a brief coffee break. The library's 24-hour cafe was buzzing with other students similarly burning the midnight oil, and the air was thick with the aroma of espresso and the low hum of hushed conversations. I checked my phone again, noting the absence of any message from Brandon. A ripple of concern stirred within me, but I was quickly pulled back into the lively banter of my friends, discussing the latest episode of a popular design reality show. By 2 a.m. the project was shaping up, but the fatigue was setting in. We powered through with energy drinks and the collective adrenaline that comes from nearing the finish line. I sent another message to Brandon, a bit more detailed this time. Still working hard. Miss you. The read receipt popped up almost immediately, but there was no reply. The silence gnawed at me, making the coffee seem a bit more bitter. As 4 a.m. rolled around, we were in the final stretch, adding the last touches to our project. The room was quieter now, the earlier excitement giving way to focused concentration and the occasional yawn. I sent one last update to Brandon, half hoping he'd respond with words of encouragement or at least acknowledge my efforts. Almost done here. Can't wait for you to see the final product. Love you. The lack of response this time felt heavier, more loaded. I stared at the screen for a moment longer than necessary, the glow highlighting the worry lines that had formed between my brows. Finally, around 5:30 a.m., we wrapped up. Our project, a visually stunning presentation of geometric and organic shapes, stood as a testament to our hard work and collaborative spirit. There was a collective sigh of relief mixed with pride as we packed up our things. Despite the successful conclusion, my heart wasn't fully in the celebration. The unanswered messages from Brandon cast a shadow over my mood. I arrived home just as the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The apartment was silent, Brandon's side of the bed untouched, indicating he hadn't slept. On the kitchen counter, I found a note from him. Went out to clear my head. We'll talk when I get back. The terse note was unlike his usual thoughtful messages and did little to ease the knot of anxiety that had tightened in my stomach over the course of the night. The words, so stark and devoid of his usual warmth, felt like a cold draft through the room. It was not like him to leave such a terse message. Sitting at the edge of our bed, I felt the weight of the night's efforts on my shoulders and the heavier burden of an unresolved conflict waiting in the wings. The joy of our project's completion was tinged with a sadness that felt all too familiar lately. A reminder of how distant Brandon and I had become in such a short span of time. As I awaited his return, the excitement of the night faded into the background, overshadowed by the uncertainty of the conversation that awaited us. Brandon returned home late in the noon, the sound of the front door closing a signal that a confrontation was imminent. I could hear the muffled sounds of his movements as he hung up his coat and placed his keys in the dish by the entrance, each noise echoing slightly in the tense silence of our apartment. The atmosphere was charged, heavy with the anticipation of the difficult conversation that lay ahead. He found me in the living room, where I had been staring out the window at the cityscape, lost in thought and dreading his return. As he entered, his expression was unreadable, a mask that hid whatever emotions he had stewed in during his hours away. He paused at the doorway, his posture rigid, and then slowly approached where I sat. "So, you were out all night for a project?" His tone was skeptical, laced with a bitterness that made me wince. The question felt like an accusation, a prelude to an argument I wasn't ready to have but knew was unavoidable. "Yes, Brandon, it was for my final project. You know how important this is for my grade," I responded, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fatigue and emotional strain. "I didn't want to be out so late either, but we had to get everything finished. It's not something I can just put off." Brandon scoffed, shaking his head as he paced a few steps before turning to face me again. "All night, though? Seems like a bit much for just a project. You could have done some of it at home, couldn't you? Why did it have to be an all-nighter?" His doubt stung, and I could feel the defensive walls building up inside me. It wasn't just me, the whole group was there. We needed to work together to get it all done. It's not something I can control. Everyone was counting on each other. He continued to look unconvinced, his arms folded across his chest as he leaned back slightly against the wall. "It just doesn't sit right with me, you being out like that and not even a call to check in. How am I supposed to trust that?" The room seemed smaller with each word, the air between us thick with unsaid things and pent-up frustrations. I was so tired from this, so exhausted from the project and the sleepless night. "I'm telling you the truth, Brandon. I'm too busy to call. But I've texted a lot but you haven't replied." Brandon's gaze hardened, and he let out a long sigh, a sound of frustration and disbelief mixed together. "I don't know, it just doesn't feel right. Something about this doesn't add up." The conversation spiraled from there, with each of us rehashing old grievances and misunderstandings, our voices rising and falling in a familiar dance of conflict. Despite my attempts to explain the necessity of the night out, Brandon remained skeptical, his trust seemingly eroded by the incident. As the discussion wore on, I felt a profound exhaustion wash over me, not just from the lack of sleep but from the constant battle to justify my actions and intentions. It was draining, this feeling of having to defend my commitment to both my education and our relationship, and as the afternoon light began to fade, so too did my resolve to keep arguing. Finally, I stood up, a gesture that paused our heated exchange. "I need some rest, Brandon," I said quietly, the fight gone from my voice. "I'm sorry you feel this way, but I've told you the truth. I hope you can believe me." Without waiting for his response, I turned and headed towards our bedroom, leaving Brandon in the living room, surrounded by the silence that quickly filled the space I had vacated. The unresolved tensions remained, a silent specter in our home, as I closed the bedroom door behind me, seeking a refuge from the turmoil and a few hours of much-needed sleep. As the gentle colors of the morning light pierced the darkness, I looked forward to a peaceful morning to relax after the strenuous project session. However, the sudden ringing of my phone shattered the quiet of our apartment, catching me off guard. It was Brandon. Considering the time and the tense messages we had exchanged earlier, I prepared myself for a challenging conversation, but I was still utterly unprepared for the events that were about to unfold. As the soft hues of dawn broke through the night, I anticipated a quiet morning to unwind after the intense project session. However, my phone's sharp ring cut through the stillness of our apartment, startling me. It was Brandon. Given the hour and the strained messages from earlier, I braced myself for a difficult conversation, but nothing could have prepared me for what was about to happen. "Hello?" My voice was groggy, tinged with sleep and anxiety. The sounds that met my ears were not words but moans, distinct, unmistakable sounds of intimacy. My mind raced as I tried to process the audio assault. Confusion gave way to a horrifying realization as Brandon's voice came through the line, breathy and cruel. "I wanted you to hear what you've been missing," he said, a hard edge to his whispered words. The background noise didn't subside. It was clear he was not alone. The shock hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. My hand trembled as I held the phone, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger, hurt, and disbelief. How could the man I loved subject me to such a deliberate act of humiliation and spite? There was a pause, a soft shuffle, then Brandon's voice again, colder this time. "Because maybe now you'll understand how it feels to be unwanted," he said, before the line went dead. The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering against the hardwood floor. I stood frozen, the echo of his words reverberating in my mind, each syllable a shard of glass in my heart. The pain was sharp and deep, a betrayal that cut to the core of my being. Tears spilled over, hot and unchecked, as I sank to the floor. The room spun around me, a whirl of dark thoughts and unanswered questions. Who was the woman he was with? But more than anything, why would he choose such a devastating way to express his pain? In my shock, I called Anna immediately. She came to my apartment and rushed into the room. She was by my side, her hands gently lifting my chin to meet her worried gaze. What happened? Oh my God, are you okay? Her voice was laced with concern, her eyes searching mine for an explanation. I shook my head, the words catching in my throat. Through sobs, I recounted the phone call, each word punctuated by a fresh wave of tears. Anna listened in silence, her arm wrapping around my shoulders in a comforting embrace. This isn't just about tonight, is it? She murmured after I had finished, her voice soft but steady. There's more going on here, more pain than just this moment. She was right. The incident wasn't an isolated one but a climax of ongoing tensions and unspoken grievances that had been building between Brandon and me. It was the breaking point of something that had been fracturing slowly, painfully, over time. Anna stayed with me as dawn turned to day, offering silent support as I processed the initial shock, and began to consider the implications of what had happened. The reality of the situation was harsh. Not only had Brandon violated our trust in the most intimate way, but he had also used his actions as a weapon, a way to hurt me as deeply as he felt hurt. We need to talk about this, not just you and me, but you and him, Anna finally said, her tone firm. This can't be brushed under the rug, it's too big, too painful. She was right. As much as I dreaded the confrontation, I knew it was necessary. The foundation of our relationship had been shaken, perhaps irrevocably, and it was clear that things could not continue as they had been. With Anna's encouragement, I found the strength to call Brandon later that day. My voice was steadier than I felt, bolstered by the conviction that I deserved better than the cruelty he had shown. Brandon. We need to talk, I started, my words clear despite the tremor of emotion that underlaid them. What you did this morning was beyond hurtful. It was destructive. There was a heavy silence on the other end before Brandon responded. His voice was subdued, lacking the harshness of earlier. I know, he admitted, and for a moment, I thought I heard a hint of regret from him. I was angry, hurt. I had no idea how else to show, so I did that. Brandon, hurting me like that, making me listen while you were with someone else. That's not a way to solve anything. It's just causing more pain, I continued, my voice firm but shaking with the weight of my emotions. I know, he repeated, his voice low. I wasn't thinking, I just felt so disconnected from you, and I don't know what I thought. I'm sorry, truly. His apology was a start, but the road to healing seemed long and fraught with potential setbacks. The trust between us had been deeply damaged, and I was unsure if it could ever fully be restored. After the phone call with Brandon, I retreated to the safety of our bedroom. The four walls felt like a sanctuary from the chaos and emotional turmoil that had erupted in our living room. Lying on our bed, I couldn't shake off the deep-seated sadness that clung to me, nor the images of Brandon's face, twisted with accusation and mistrust. My mind spun in circles, reflecting on the spiraling decline of our relationship. It was a cycle, tension, and misunderstanding that seemed to repeat itself with increasing intensity. I thought back to the early days with Brandon, when each moment together was filled with laughter and spontaneity. Those memories now seemed like echoes of a distant past, a stark contrast to our current reality where smiles were rare and silences were loaded with unsaid grievances. It wasn't just the lack of trust or the painful confrontation that morning. It was the realization that I no longer recognized the man I had fallen in love with. He had become a stranger, one who could willingly inflict pain with such calculated indifference. As I lay there, a mix of exhaustion and despair washing over me, my phone buzzed with incoming messages. Reluctantly, I reached over to check it, finding texts from Anna and a missed call from my sister Leah. I dialed Leah back, needing the familiar comfort of her voice. Hey Leah, I began, my voice cracking slightly. Hey, what's wrong? I could sense something was off from your text, she responded, her tone immediately shifting to one of concern. I recounted the morning's events, the call from Brandon, and the painful words exchanged. Leah listened silently, only interjecting to ask clarifying questions. When I finished, there was a heavy pause. That's just cruel, you know? It's not like you to tolerate this kind of behavior, not from anyone. Leah finally said. Her words, firm and straightforward, mirrored my own thoughts. It was a reflection of how far I had strayed from the person I used to be, someone who valued self-respect and mutual understanding above all in a relationship. Yeah, I know. I don't even know who he was anymore, I admitted, feeling the weight of my own words. I can't keep going like this. It's draining me, Leah. It's not healthy. You deserve so much better, Leah replied, her voice soft yet insistent. You need to think about what you really want moving forward, not just for the sake of the relationship, but for yourself. Her words sparked something within me, a flicker of determination amidst the confusion. It was a call to reclaim the parts of myself that I had neglected in my attempts to salvage our faltering relationship. I needed to reflect on what I truly wanted, not just drift along in the current of Brandon's moods and accusations. Later that day, I met with Anna for coffee. As always, she was a grounding presence, someone who could always cut through the noise and help me see things more clearly. As I sipped my coffee, Anna laid it out plainly. Everyone sees it, you know. You're not yourself anymore. You're always tense, always worrying about how to navigate around Brandon's feelings. When's the last time you did something just for yourself? Something that made you happy? Her question hung in the air, stark and challenging. I didn't have an answer, and that in itself was telling. He's changed, Anna. Or maybe I'm just seeing the side of him he's hidden all this time, I said, the realization bitter. Maybe, Anna agreed, her brow furrowed in thought. But more importantly, what are you going to do about it? That was the question, wasn't it? What was I going to do? The thought of continuing in a relationship where I felt so undervalued, so misunderstood, was unbearable. Yet the thought of ending things, of stepping into the unknown after all we had shared, was daunting. Over the next few days, I took time to myself, reflecting on my values, my needs, and my future. I thought about the kind of love I wanted. The kind that was nurturing, respectful, and joyful. It was clear that what Brandon and I had now was far from those ideals. The love had been overshadowed by resentment and pain, a far cry from the partnership I envisioned. I realized that moving forward alone was a better path than staying in a relationship that had lost its way. It wasn't just about finding happiness but about preserving my self-respect and rediscovering the strength I had before the relationship consumed me. With a heavy heart but a clear mind, I decided it was time to end the relationship with Brandon. I needed to express my decision, not out of spite or anger, but from a place of honesty and self-respect. I hoped that he would release me, that he could see the necessity of the choice I was making. The decision to end our relationship was not easy, but it was necessary. It was a step towards healing, towards reclaiming the joy and peace that had once defined my life. As I prepared to have that final conversation with Brandon, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for all that we had lost, and relief that I was finally taking a step towards a future where I could be myself again, free from the shadows that our love had become. With Brandon, the conclusion was just as challenging as I had expected. But beneath all the pain, there was a resolve that persisted. I was clear in expressing my demands and the sadness of a relationship that had deviated too much from happiness and respect for one another. As he listened, Brandon's expressions were a mixture of resignation and quiet recognition. Ultimately, he comprehended and acknowledged my choice, even though it was evident he was upset and regretful. In the weeks that followed, the immediate sense of relief I felt was tinged with moments of profound loneliness. Our shared apartment, once alive with shared dreams, now echoed with the quietness of solitude. I spent long evenings reflecting on what had gone wrong, turning over the memories, both sweet and bitter. This introspection, though painful, was a necessary part of my healing process. Gradually, the sharpness of recent wounds gave way to a more profound understanding of myself and my boundaries. I began to reconnect with old friends, and my family. Relationships that had been somewhat neglected, became sources of comfort and joy. Their support was instrumental in rebuilding the sense of self that had been eroded in my efforts to save a failing relationship. The knowledge I gained from this period of my life was priceless but difficult to get. I came to understand the value of being honest and open with myself as well as with a partner. I realized the danger of compromising too much and losing oneself in the attempt to keep others happy. I made a self-promise to put emotional fulfillment and respect for the other person before my dread of being alone in a relationship. As I move forward, the scars from this experience remain. But they are a testament to my resilience. They remind me that I have the strength to face difficult truths and make tough decisions, that I deserve to be loved fully and without reservation. The journey of reclaiming the joy and peace I once knew is ongoing, but now I walk it with a clearer vision of who I am, and what I truly value in life and love. I appreciate everyone listening to and reading my story. I have removed it from the platforms where I published it since I believe the details of what he did with me should not reflect poorly on my accounts. The only page I want to share a tale on is this one. Please leave a comment after hearing the story so I know what everyone thinks. I'll probably read it several times over. I want to thank you again for bearing with me as I confessed. My boyfriend was so angry that he didn't even talk to me because I didn't check my phone when I went out. I tried to explain but he didn't accept it.
Living with Alex has been like sharing my space with a permanent fixture of excitement and unpredictability. It's a roller coaster that neither of us ever really asked for, but ended up riding anyway. We're both young, figuring out life in our own corners of the world. And somehow, our corners collided and stuck together. I'm 24, knee-deep in design projects that never seem to end, and Alex, a year older, is always tangled up in the latest software development at his startup. Our lives are hectic, to say the least, but we've managed to find our little bubble of calm within the storm, or so I thought. On the fateful Saturday that threw everything off balance, I had planned to spend the day at Sarah's place. She's my go-to person when the world seems too much, a fellow art enthusiast, and a reminder that life isn't just deadlines and briefs. Alex was supposed to hang out with Mike, his childhood friend who's the epitome of a free spirit, always dragging Alex into one adventure or another. Given our plans, I thought it'd be a day like any other, where we'd both do our thing and reconvene at home, filled with stories to share. That morning over coffee, I remember telling Alex I'd be at Sarah's. He nodded, absorbed in his phone, a nonverbal cue I took as understanding. As the day unfolded in Sarah's cozy living room, filled with art supplies and half-finished canvases, I felt a wave of relaxation I hadn't experienced in a long time. We talked, painted and shared a simple lunch, our phones forgotten in another room as we immersed ourselves in creativity and laughter. I had texted Alex before diving into the day, asking about his plans for the evening, wondering if he and Mike would want to join Sarah and me for dinner. When I didn't hear back, I shrugged it off, assuming he was caught up in the moment just as I was. It was a decision I'd come to regret. After what felt like mere minutes but was actually hours, the need to check my phone nagged at me, pulling me away from the canvas in front of me. Finding my phone was the easy part facing the storm. It unlocked was not. 11 missed calls, numerous texts, each more frantic than the last, from Alex demanding to know where I was, why I wasn't answering. Panic knotted in my stomach as I called him back, only for it to go straight to voicemail. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing through every worst-case scenario. Arriving back to our shared apartment felt like stepping into a parallel universe where everything was the same yet irrevocably different. Alex's anger was a tangible force, cold and unyielding. My explanations, my apologies, seemed to dissipate before they could even reach him. He accused me of never listening, of always keeping my phone on silent as if it were a crime I was perpetually guilty of. His words stung, not because they were entirely untrue, but because they highlighted how little we understood each other's needs in moments of separation. The silence in our apartment, a stark contrast to the laughter and warmth that had filled Sarah's place just hours before. I could feel Alex's anger in every deliberate movement he made, a silent storm brewing. It was as if the air itself was thick with unspoken words, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. I approached him tentatively, my heart pounding in my chest. "Alex, I'm so sorry," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize my phone was on silent. I never meant to worry you." He didn't turn to face me. His posture remained rigid, the muscles in his back tensing further at my words. The silence stretched between us, a gaping chasm that seemed to grow wider with each passing second. I waited for him to say something, anything, but he remained silent, a statue of contained fury. Feeling my resolve waver, I tried again, desperation seeping into my tone. "Please, can we talk about this? I know I messed up, but I want to make it right." Finally he turned, his expression a mask of frustration and hurt. "You never listen," he snapped, his words like daggers. "Your phone is always on silent. You're always in your own world, oblivious to everything else." I flinched at the harshness in his voice, the accusation stinging more than I cared to admit. It was true that I often kept my phone on silent, a habit born from my desire to find moments of peace in our constantly connected world. But I had never considered how this might affect Alex, how my actions, however unintentional, could be interpreted as negligence. "I didn't think it was a big deal," I stammered, struggling to defend my actions without dismissing his feelings. "I just wanted a day without distractions. I didn't mean to ignore you." "But you did," he countered, his voice rising in anger. "You ignored me, ignored my calls, my messages. How do you think that made me feel? Like I'm not important enough to warrant even a moment of your attention." His words cut deep, revealing the depth of his hurt and insecurity. It dawned on me then that this wasn't just about a missed call or a silent phone. It was about feeling valued, feeling heard, something we had both seemingly taken for granted in our relationship. I opened my mouth to respond, to try and explain how much he meant to me. But he continued, unleashing months of pent-up frustration. It's always the same with you. You're there, but not really. You listen, but you don't hear. I'm tired of feeling like I'm talking to a wall. His harsh assessment of our communication, or lack thereof, was a bitter pill to swallow. I had always prided myself on being a good listener, but here was Alex, the person I loved, telling me I was failing him in the most basic aspect of our relationship. The room seemed to close in on me as he spoke. Each word a weight added to the burden of guilt and realization I now carried. I had been so wrapped up in my own world, my own needs, that I had failed to see how my actions affected the person closest to me. I'm sorry, I whispered, the words feeling inadequate in the face of his anger. I didn't realize how much this was affecting you. Please, let's figure this out together. But he was done talking. Turning away, he left the room, leaving me alone with the weight of our unresolved issues. The silence that followed was a different kind, one filled with regret and the painful understanding that apologies were not. As the silence stretched on, becoming a constant presence in our home, I knew that something had to give. The days following our confrontation felt like moving through a thick fog, each step uncertain and heavy with the weight of our unresolved issues. The silence between us was a constant presence, an uninvited guest that neither of us seemed capable of dismissing. It was during these days of silence that I realized the gravity of the situation and the urgent need for a resolution. Determined to bridge the gap that had formed between us, I decided to write Alex a letter. It seemed archaic, perhaps, in an age dominated by instant messaging and emails, but it felt right. A letter would allow me to articulate my thoughts without the risk of being interrupted or misunderstood. It would be a tangible expression of my sincerity, something he could hold in his hands and read in his own time. I spent hours drafting and redrafting the letter, each word carefully chosen, each sentence a step towards reconciliation. I poured out my heart on those pages, expressing my regret over the incident and the pain of the days that followed. I acknowledged my part in our communication breakdown, and expressed my desire to work through our issues together. I left the letter on his pillow, a silent plea for understanding and forgiveness. Days passed without any sign that he had read the letter, the tension in our apartment growing with each silent meal and avoided glance. It was during this time of uncertainty that I sought advice from those closest to me. I spoke first to Sarah, my confidant and partner in art. Over cups of coffee in her cluttered kitchen, I shared the details of our argument and my fears for the future of my relationship. Sarah listened with the patience of a saint, her eyes filled with sympathy and concern. She offered no easy solutions but reminded me of the importance of patience and open communication. Relationships are like canvases, she said. Sometimes they require a bit of reworking to get right. Encouraged by Sarah's metaphor, I next sought the perspective of my older brother, David. Known for his pragmatic approach to life, David had always been my sounding board for practical matters. His advice was characteristically straightforward. Talk to him, he urged. Not through letters or texts, but face to face. Show him you're willing to listen and change. Buoyed by their words, I resolved to make one more attempt at initiating conversation with Alex. That day I decided to talk to Alex first. He went to work late again and it seemed like he didn't want to talk to me. I curled up on the couch, lost in a book, when the phone rang. The sharp trill shattered the quiet, making my heart leap into my throat. It was Alex's number, but the voice on the other end wasn't his. It was Mike, his voice edged with panic, informing me that Alex had been in a minor bike accident on his way home. Fear, sharp and all-consuming, propelled me into action. I barely remember grabbing my keys and rushing out the door, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. The hospital was a blur of white walls and hushed voices, and then I saw him, bruised but alive, his arm in a sling. Relief flooded through me, mingling with the remnants of fear to create a cocktail of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. It was in that sterile hospital room, surrounded by the beeping of machines, that the walls between us finally came down. The tension that had been our constant companion dissolved in the face of the stark reminder of how fragile life could be. Alex's eyes met mine, and I saw the vulnerability there, the unspoken fear that mirrored my own. Words were unnecessary. Our shared relief was palpable, a bridge over the chasm that had divided us. Later, when we were finally alone, the heart-to-heart that had been weeks in the making unfolded with an ease that surprised us both. The conversation started hesitantly, each of us testing the waters, but the floodgates soon opened. releasing a torrent of pent-up emotions and unvoiced fears. Alex spoke first, his voice low and tinged with pain. Not from his injuries but from the emotional toll. He admitted how the accident had made him realize the fragility of everything we took for granted, including our relationship. The thought of losing what we had over something as trivial as missed calls and misunderstandings seemed absurdly foolish now. I listened, really listened, letting his words wash over me, feeling the weight of them in my heart. When it was my turn, I spoke from a place of raw honesty, sharing my own realizations about the importance of communication and the dangers of complacency. I confessed how the fear of seeing him hurt had brought into sharp focus the depth of my feelings for him, how the idea of losing him was unbearable. We talked about the need for balance, for finding a middle ground where we could both feel heard and valued. We discussed practical steps to improve our communication, like setting aside dedicated time each day to connect without distractions, and agreeing to voice our concerns and frustrations before they escalated into resentment. It was a conversation marked by tears and laughter, by apologies and forgiveness. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt truly connected to Alex, not just as my partner but as my best friend, my confidant. We laid bare our fears and desires, not just for our relationship, but for our individual selves within it. As we left the hospital, Alex's arm draped over my shoulders for support. I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for his safety, for the strength of our bond, and for the unexpected incident that had jolted us out of complacency and into a deeper understanding of each other. In the days that followed our night at the hospital, the atmosphere in our apartment underwent a palpable shift. The cloud of tension that had loomed over us dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of understanding and connection. It was as if the accident had jolted us back to reality, reminding us of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing every moment we had together. Our journey towards understanding and forgiveness wasn't instantaneous. It required effort, patience, and a willingness to truly listen to each other. We started by setting aside time each evening to talk not just about our day but about how we were feeling, what was troubling us, and how we could support each other better. These conversations were sometimes difficult, opening up old wounds and exposing vulnerabilities we had both tried to hide. But they were also healing, providing us with the opportunity to acknowledge our mistakes and express forgiveness. I admitted to Alex how I had allowed my need for solitude and silence to overshadow his need for connection and communication. I recognized how my habit of keeping my phone on silent had contributed to his feelings of being ignored and undervalued. In turn, Alex acknowledged how his reaction to the incident, his anger, and the subsequent silent treatment had only served to exacerbate the situation, driving a wedge between us instead of fostering a constructive dialogue. Forgiveness came slowly, like the mending of a delicate fabric, stitch by stitch. We learned to forgive not just each other but ourselves, for the missteps and misunderstandings that had brought us to this point. It was a process that required humility and the recognition that we were both flawed, human, and doing the best we could. As we navigated this path of reconciliation, we also began to lay the groundwork for a new way of communicating. We agreed on several ground rules to prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. The first, and perhaps most important rule, was that we would never leave our phones on silent when we were apart. This simple change, though small, symbolized our commitment to being accessible to each other, to prioritizing our connection over the distractions of daily life. We also decided to implement a no-screens policy during meals, dedicating that time solely to each other. This helped us create a space where we could connect without interruptions, sharing stories, thoughts, and laughter without the constant buzzing of notifications. Another strategy we adopted was the use of a communication jar. Whenever we felt frustrated or misunderstood but weren't ready to talk about it, we would write down our feelings and drop the note into the jar. This allowed us to acknowledge our emotions without forcing an immediate conversation, giving us both time to reflect and approach the issue with a cooler head. Perhaps the most significant change, however, was our commitment to practicing active listening. We made a conscious effort to listen to each other without formulating a response in our minds, to truly hear what the other was saying, and to empathize with their perspective. This shift in our approach to communication transformed our conversations, making them more meaningful and less prone to misunderstandings. As we implemented these new strategies and habits, our relationship began to flourish in ways we hadn't anticipated. We discovered new depths to our connection, finding joy in the simple act of sharing our day or discussing our dreams for the future. The challenges we had faced became a catalyst for growth, pushing us to strengthen our bond and deepen our understanding of each other. The journey from confrontation to resolution had been a long one, marked by moments of doubt, fear, and frustration. But it had also been a journey of discovery, a reminder of the power of love, communication, and forgiveness. We had emerged from it stronger, more resilient, and more committed to each other than ever before. Looking back, I realized that every relationship faces its share of trials and tribulations. What matters is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to navigate it together, to learn from it, and to emerge stronger on the other side. Our experience has taught us that with empathy, patience, and a willingness to listen, there is no obstacle too great to overcome. As we settled into this new chapter of our relationship, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the second chance we had been given. We had been given the opportunity to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect, understanding, and love. And as we moved forward, hand in hand, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, stronger and more united than ever.
Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you. My brother-in-law who married my sister told my wife that he was in love with her. This led to a chain of horrific discoveries in our family. Yesterday, out of the blue, my brother-in-law asked my wife if she could meet him for lunch. He said there was something he needed to talk to her about. When my wife told me about his invitation, she seemed puzzled but not overly concerned. "Do you think it's about my sister?" she asked, furrowing her brow. "Maybe they're having problems, and he wants to get a woman's perspective on things." I found the whole situation odd. My brother-in-law had never reached out to my wife in this way before, but he often texted her and other family members for mundane reasons, so I didn't think much of it. After all, we were a close-knit family, and it wasn't unusual for us to support each other through tough times. "Go find out," I told her, shrugging off my initial unease. My wife agreed, deciding to meet him at a cafe near her office the next day. The next morning, as she was getting ready for work, she mentioned lunch again. "I'm still not sure what this is about," she said, a hint of worry in her voice. I reassured her, saying it was probably nothing serious. "Just listen to what he has to say, and if it's something we need to help with, we'll figure it out together," I said. It's a busy cafe, filled with the usual lunchtime crowd, and my wife feels a bit more at ease being in such a public setting. She arrives a bit early, finding a table near the window where she can keep an eye on the entrance. He arrives a few minutes later, looking more nervous than she's ever seen him. They exchange the usual pleasantries, talking about work and the kids for a few minutes. But then, as soon as their food arrives, he takes a deep breath and dives into what he really came to say. He starts by complimenting her, telling her how beautiful she looks. At first, she thinks he's just being polite, but then he keeps going. He tells her how she's always been the light in his life, how she makes him feel things he's never felt before. "It was love at first sight," he says, his voice trembling slightly. "I've loved you since the moment I first laid eyes on you. If you were mine, I would treat you like the queen you are. I'd give you everything you deserve." My wife is stunned. She stares at him, unable to believe what she's hearing. This man, my brother-in-law, married to my sister and father of their 2 kids, is pouring his heart out to her. He lays it on thick, making grand promises about how different life would be if they were together. He goes on, saying how he's been holding these feelings in for years, how he's watched her and admired her from afar, feeling more and more that they're meant to be together. She tries to interrupt, to tell him he's making a huge mistake, but he keeps talking over her, almost as if he's rehearsed this speech 1,000 times in his head. Mind you, this man has always had a friendly relationship with my wife. Our families see each other often since we're a close-knit bunch. He's always been the fun uncle to our kids, the guy who's there at every family barbecue, every holiday dinner. He does text my wife frequently, but it's always been about mundane things, the kids' schedules, family events, things like that. Nothing overly sexual, nothing that would set off any alarms. In fact, he texts and calls my mom too. They have a friendly rapport, and none of us ever thought anything of it. To us, he's always been just a good guy, someone we trust implicitly. So to hear my wife recount this to me is like a punch to the gut. My wife doesn't let him finish. She stands up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and walks out. She's shaking as she calls me, telling me everything that just happened. While she's on the phone with me, the texts from him start. First it's apologies. He didn't mean it, he thinks it's only infatuation. He's sorry for making her uncomfortable. But the damage is done. She leaves work early to come home and talk to me about this, her phone buzzing incessantly with his calls and messages. I tell her to answer one of his calls, to put him on speaker so I can hear. He's crying, begging her not to tell my sister. He keeps saying it was a mistake, that he misread signals, That he thought she felt the same way. Apparently, when we were together this past weekend, he thought my wife was flirting with him, that they had a moment alone in our kitchen where he felt a connection. My wife is a major ballbuster, and I suppose I can see how that can be taken as flirting, but this? This is beyond anything we could have imagined. He asks if she told me, and I answer yes, as I'm on speaker. Then he starts begging me to, pleading for us to keep this a secret. This went on for a while, him begging and us listening. My main question was whether he had cheated on my sister before. He swore he hadn't, swearing on his kids' lives that it was just my wife. He said I should understand that it was her, only her. At that point, I was done listening. I told him I wasn't going to do anything tonight and that I'd call him tomorrow. Now we're left with this mess, not knowing what to do next. My wife says we should drive over there right now and tell my sister, but the idea of wrecking my sister's family is killing me. Thinking about what this will do to my nieces makes me want to vomit. I know the right thing to do is to tell my sister, but I'm also thinking about my wife. It's not her fault, but there's sure to be resentment from my family. Even if my sister doesn't divorce him and they reconcile, I can't see how we'll ever be together again like we were before, if at all. This whole episode can tear my family apart. I don't give a shit about him. He tried to destroy my family, but I do care about everyone else. Update. So everyone that told me last night that I couldn't wait to tell my sister was right. A little after 12, I got a call from my sister. She sounded upset and said she had to tell me something. My heart sank as she explained that her husband, my brother-in-law, had come to her in tears, claiming my wife had tried to begin an affair with him. He spun a tale where my wife was the instigator, trying to shift the blame entirely onto her. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I immediately told my sister that wasn't the case and assured her I would be right over. This situation needed to be addressed face to face, not over the phone. I hung up and, with a sense of urgency, called my parents. I woke my mother and father, explaining what was happening in quick clipped sentences. My father was furious. My mother sounded shocked, but resolute. They agreed to head over to my sister's house to sit with her kids, offering the support she would desperately need right now. Next, I called my younger brother. He groggily answered, confusion turning to alarm as I filled him in. He promised to come over to our place and stay with our kids, ensuring they wouldn't be left alone during this turmoil. His calm, steady presence would be a comfort to them. Meanwhile, my wife was already gathering her things, her face pale and drawn. She was dreading the confrontation, but knew it was necessary. We left the house in a hurry, the drive to my sister's place feeling longer than it actually was. The silence in the car was heavy, both of us lost in our thoughts. When we arrived, the scene was even more tense than I had imagined. My sister is out on the front porch with my brother-in-law when we get there. He looks beaten, eyes downcast, his posture slumped in defeat. He knows we have the texts and voicemails, the undeniable proof of his betrayal. I really don't know what he was hoping to accomplish by calling my sister in the middle of the night with his lies. Maybe he thought he could get ahead of the story, twist the narrative to save himself, but it was a futile effort. As we walk up to them, the tension in the air is palpable. My wife is trembling, her face a mask of controlled anger and hurt. She hands my sister her phone without a word. My sister takes it, her hands steady but her eyes burning with a mix of fury and pain. She scrolls through the texts, her expression hardening, with each one she reads. Then she listens to the voicemails, the damning evidence of his declarations, and her refusals. Before she can say anything, my brother-in-law starts sobbing. This is a man who runs into burning buildings, who faces danger daily without flinching. Seeing him like this, broken and vulnerable, is jarring. His cries are deep and guttural, raw with regret and fear. It's a scene that's almost surreal. A big tough firefighter brought to his knees by his own actions. My sister's face remains impassive, a mask of stern resolve. She's always been tough, but right now, she's unyielding. She waits for him to finish, her silence more powerful than any words. When he finally quiets down, still hiccuping with the remnants of his sobs, she speaks. Pack a bag and go, she says, her voice cold and clear. I can't stand to look at you. He tries to argue, to plead his case, but she's having none of it. Stop it, she snaps, cutting through his words. There's nothing you can say that will make this better. She turns away from him, walks over to my wife, and pulls her into a hug. It's a moment of solidarity between them, a small comfort in the middle of this nightmare. They've been friends since college, and the strength of their bond is evident. It's a relief to see that despite everything, they're standing together. This leaves me standing with my brother-in-law. He's a wreck, his face red and swollen from crying, his shoulders slumped. He looks at me, his eyes pleading for some kind of understanding or forgiveness, but I have none to offer. He tries to speak, his voice cracking, but I cut him off. You need to leave, I say firmly. This is your mess. You need to deal with the consequences. He nods, defeated, and slowly makes his way inside to pack his things. My sister stays with my wife, the two of them talking quietly, leaning on each other for support. The rest of the night is a blur of conversations and plans. We all rally around my sister, helping her figure out what to do next, how to protect her kids from the fallout. My sister begins questioning my wife, trying to understand why her husband thought any of this could possibly work out. He must have had some reason to believe she reciprocated his feelings. My sister insists that there hadn't been any issues in their marriage, everything had been normal. My wife is crying at this point, tears streaming down her face as she tries to make sense of the situation. There's nothing you haven't seen, she says, her voice shaking. She hands my sister her phone again, and together they painstakingly go through every text message sent over the past 2 years. They read each one carefully, looking for any hint of inappropriate behavior, but there's nothing there. My wife was just being herself. She has a playful personality, always joking around and teasing. It's part of what makes her so lovable and approachable. My brother-in-law has a similar sense of humor, and they've always teased each other in a lighthearted, harmless way. She does the same with my mom and my younger brother. It's just how she interacts with people. The only incident my wife can think of that might have been misconstrued happened this past weekend. She recounts it, trying to pinpoint where things went wrong. They were all together at our place, and she and my brother-in-law both reached for the fridge at the same time. They playfully jostled for who would get there first, laughing as they did so. He let her win, but then he reached around her waist to grab a beer, moving his hand slowly. She admits that in that moment, the way he did it felt a little inappropriate. It was a fleeting feeling, and she brushed it off, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. She wonders now if her silence gave him some misguided hope. My sister listens, her expression softening. She doesn't blame my wife for any of this. She knows her well enough to understand that her playful nature isn't an invitation for anything more. It's not your fault, she reassures her, and my wife nods, though the guilt still lingers. As they finish reading through the messages, it's clear there was never any mutual attraction, no hidden signals or secret flirtations. My wife was just being herself, and my brother-in-law took that, and twisted it into something it wasn't. The realization that this misunderstanding has caused so much pain is almost too much to bear, but at least, for now, my sister's belief in my wife remains intact. So then, my sister starts going through his MacBook to see what else she doesn't know about. She's angry and frantic at this point, her hands shaking as she types. She guesses the password, and on the third try, she's in. With a deep breath, she starts searching through his files, looking for anything that might shed more light on this nightmare. It doesn't take long before she finds something disturbing. There, buried in a folder labeled innocuously, are a lot of pictures of my wife. They date back years, and what's more unsettling is that they're always isolated shots, just her, never in group settings or candid family moments. My sister clicks through them, her anger turning into a cold, creeping horror. One set of photos stands out. A few years ago, we went on a couple's trip to the Caribbean. It was a rare vacation without the kids, and my wife, feeling more relaxed in the adults-only environment, had worn a bikini. She usually doesn't, preferring more modest swimwear, but this time she had felt comfortable enough to do so. There were probably 50 pictures of her in that bikini, each one taken without her knowledge. My sister's face pales as she scrolls through them. It's clear he's been secretly snapping these photos for years, collecting them obsessively. The realization that he's been harboring this fixation, lurking in the shadows of family events, sends a shiver down her spine. Does this now enter restraining order territory? She wonders aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. This has taken a creepy turn, far beyond what any of us had imagined. The boundary between inappropriate and outright disturbing has been crossed. She calls us over, showing us the pictures. My wife gasps, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. She had no idea he was doing this, no inkling of his obsession. My sister, her anger now tempered by a deep sense of betrayal, starts talking about next steps. Legal action, protection for her kids, and a restraining order. All possibilities that need to be considered now. We're all reeling from this new discovery. The man we thought we knew, who we trusted as a husband, a father, and a brother-in-law, has shown a side of himself that's dark and disturbing. It's not just a matter of infatuation anymore, it's something far more insidious. Unfortunately, the mess continues. My sister agreed to talk to her husband last night and let him explain himself. She was determined to get the full story and decided to involve my wife directly to ensure there would be no lying or half-truths. They set up a FaceTime call with my wife, and I listened in off camera, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and dread. My sister, ever thorough, recorded the entire conversation for good measure. As soon as the call began, the tension was palpable. My brother-in-law looked exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed and swollen from crying. He started hesitantly, his voice shaky, but as he spoke, the truth began to pour out, and the story unfolded in a way none of us had fully anticipated. He admitted he's been obsessed with my wife for years. It started the day I met her, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. He went on to explain that it was during one of those early gatherings where my sister, eager to introduce her new boyfriend to her friends, had brought him along. My wife and I were dating at the time, but he had met her before he met me. At first, he thought his feelings were purely physical, an innocent crush that he could brush aside. But as time went on and he spent more time around her, he realized it was more than that. He became fixated on her personality, her laughter, the way she interacted with everyone around her. He described moments where he found himself watching her, captivated by her presence, even as she was just being herself, playful and kind. He detailed how he had tried to suppress these feelings, convincing himself that they were harmless. But over time, his obsession grew. He started finding ways to be near her more often, volunteering to help with family events, making excuses to text her about trivial things. It was a slow, insidious process that eventually led to the point where he felt compelled to confess his feelings, deluding himself into believing she might feel the same way. My sister listened, her face a mask of controlled rage and heartbreak. She didn't interrupt him, letting him dig his own grave with each word. My wife, on the other hand, was visibly shaken. Hearing how long this had been going on, how deeply his obsession ran, was almost too much for her to bear. When he finished, there was a heavy silence. My sister finally spoke, her voice icy and measured. "What made you think that my wife would leave me for you?" she asked, her eyes boring into his. He stammered, struggling to find the right words. He mentioned the supposed mutual attraction, the moments he had misinterpreted as signs of her reciprocation. My wife and sister exploded at that point, their pent-up anger and frustration spilling over. There was a lot of cussing, a lot of screaming, the raw emotion of betrayal and hurt coming to the forefront. My wife hung up the call, her hands trembling, her face pale. She was concerned for me, for us, assuring me repeatedly that the attraction was one-sided. I believed her. I always had. Even if she did find him physically attractive at some point, I knew she would never act on it. She's serious about trust and fidelity. Something she made clear early on in our relationship. This whole ordeal was a twisted fantasy of my brother-in-law's, a dangerous delusion that had nearly torn our family apart. The tension that had been building up during the call finally erupted into a storm of cussing and screaming. My wife's voice was a mix of fury and hurt, while my sister's was steely and unforgiving. The barrage of emotions was overwhelming, the air thick with betrayal and disbelief. The phone call abruptly ended when my wife, shaking and distraught, hung up because she was concerned for me. She turned to me, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "It was one-sided," she assured me, her voice trembling. "I never thought it wasn't," I replied, trying to soothe her. Even if she did find him physically attractive at some point, I knew she would never act on it. She's just not that type of person. Early on in our relationship, there was a moment that encapsulated her stance on trust and fidelity perfectly. I remember watching her one morning as she was dressing, admiring her without saying a word. She noticed, gave me a teasing smile and asked if I liked what I saw. But then her expression turned serious, almost cold. "Never fuck up," she said, her tone leaving no room for misunderstanding. "Or you'll never see this again." She meant every word. My wife is serious about trust. Once it's broken, it's almost impossible to mend. As I sat there, replaying the chaotic scene in my mind, I couldn't help but reflect on my brother-in-law. I knew he was a little cocky, always walking with a certain swagger, but my God, I never knew he thought so highly of himself to believe he could pull off something like this. His delusions of grandeur were staggering, completely detached from reality. I talked to my sister later on, once the initial shock had started to wear off and we could speak more calmly. She was resolute, determined to protect her children from the fallout of her husband's actions. She told me she would be contacting a lawyer first thing Monday morning to see what steps she could take to limit his exposure to their kids. She wanted to ensure that they were shielded from as much of this mess as possible. "As far as I'm concerned, he's detached from reality," she said, her voice steely with resolve. Her concern was no longer about saving her marriage but about safeguarding her children and maintaining a semblance of stability for them. Anyway, my brother-in-law returned home yesterday, not because my sister wants him back but because she can't legally stop him. Despite the turmoil and the clear betrayal, he has the right to be in the house until the legal proceedings move forward. The atmosphere is tense and uncomfortable, filled with unspoken words and palpable resentment. They are done, and I think he realizes that now. There's a hollow look in his eyes, As if he understands that any hope he had of salvaging their marriage is gone. The lawyer tells my sister that since my brother-in-law's behavior over the past few days has been documented, there is a good chance she will be granted full custody of the kids. The texts, voicemails, and the disturbing cache of photos all paint a clear picture of his obsession and instability. He doesn't seem to even want to fight her on that. It's as if he knows he's lost everything and is too weary to put up a battle. My sister will be fine. She's stronger than she looks, and any love she had for him is gone. She moves through the house with a determined air, her focus now entirely on her children and their future. She doesn't seem to be broken up about it. Rather, she looks like someone who's finally seen the truth and is ready to move forward. The kids don't know what happened yet. They sense something is wrong. Kids always do. But they don't know the details. My brother-in-law was never around much anyway when the kids were home. He often slept at the fire station, pulling double shifts and overtime. His absence was a constant in their lives, a silent but ever-present gap that they had grown used to. But it is certain to be hard on them once they know what's going to happen. The stability of their home, the presence of both parents, even if it was fractured, will change. My sister is prepared for this. She's already spoken to a child psychologist to help them navigate the inevitable questions and emotions that will arise. She's ready to be both mother and father, to provide them with the love and support they'll need. As for my brother-in-law, he stays in the guest room, a silent figure in a house that no longer feels like his home. He seems resigned to his fate, going through the motions but devoid of any real fight. It's a sad, pitiful sight, but my sympathy is limited. Some of my friends have said that there must be more women, that someone as obsessive as my brother-in-law couldn't have fixated on just one person. But as far as we can tell, there hasn't been anyone else. It's really just the obsession with my wife. His fixation on her has been singular and intense, leaving no room for anyone else. After everything came to light, my wife blocked his phone number, trying to create some distance and protect herself from his unwanted advances. But on the same night he returned home, he sent my wife an email from an account he had just made. It started with a seemingly sincere apology, but it quickly took a turn into something much darker. He began by saying he never got to finish at the restaurant that day, implying there was more he needed to confess. Then he launched into paragraphs and paragraphs about all the things he loves about my wife. He detailed the desperation he felt, the overwhelming emotions that had driven him to act so irrationally. He recounted every little detail he admired about her, her smile, her laugh, the way she interacted with others. It was unsettling, to say the least, to see his obsession laid out so starkly. He mentioned their supposed mutual attraction again, insisting that there was a palpable sexual tension between them that he had always felt. He was delusional, mistaking her friendly, playful nature for something more. He painted a picture of a connection that existed only in his mind, a fantasy that he had convinced himself was real. The email ended with a rather large section about me. Let's just say I didn't know he had such a low opinion of me. He was quite certain that I was not satisfying my wife properly. He criticized everything from my appearance to my demeanor, implying that I was somehow unworthy of her. His words were meant to undermine me, to sow seeds of doubt and insecurity. Reading the email was a gut punch. It was clear that his obsession with my wife had twisted his perceptions and fueled his disdain for me. He saw me as an obstacle, someone unworthy of the woman he had placed on a pedestal. But instead of feeling threatened, it only solidified my resolve to protect my wife, and my family, from his delusions. We forwarded the email to my sister and her lawyer. It was more evidence of his unstable state of mind, another piece of the puzzle that showed just how far gone he was. This email, with its mix of apology, obsession and vitriol, might be enough to get him removed from the house permanently. For now, my wife and I are taking it one day at a time. The support from our friends and family has been invaluable, helping us navigate this surreal and painful situation. Finally, my wife isn't doing great, but she is improving each day. She does feel guilty for being too comfortable around my brother-in-law. Normally, she is very careful about setting boundaries with other men. In case it wasn't clear, my wife is quite stunning and receives a lot of male attention. However, she felt safe around my brother-in-law because he was family, and she never thought he would cross any lines. Fortunately, she and my sister are on good terms, and there doesn't seem to be any resentment, which is a relief. We will all be okay, but it will take time. Thank you to everyone who commented and offered their support. My primary concern throughout this was my sister and her children. The impact of my brother-in-law's actions on their lives is immense. Ensuring their protection and emotional well-being became our priority. Children, especially, need shielding from such toxic situations to maintain their sense of security and normalcy. When faced with such a situation, it's essential to act quickly and decisively. We didn't hesitate to gather evidence, confront the issue, and involve legal help to ensure the safety and well-being of everyone involved. Procrastination or denial could have led to further harm. What do you think about this story? Please share your comments down below. Thank you for listening to Vibe Tales.